Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. Hey, we just wanted to say thank you to everyone who has sent us an evaluation. That information is so very important. We are still looking for feedback from our listeners. So if there's a show that you've listened to that has really helped you, then please feel free to go ahead and fill out that evaluation again and just let us know how you're using the information for the show.
Yeah, let us know how our show is helping you, whether it's a major thing, whether it's a little gold nugget you're able to get out of it. We try to mix a lot of our experiences with the show and just want to know how it helps you out.
You can fill out these evaluations as many times as you want. And also, you can use those evaluations to tell us if there's a topic that you would like us to address. So we do welcome that. And we're always looking for new ideas on things that you feel are important. So let us know what you want to learn from our show. You can find the evaluation online at https:// bit.ly extension calling evaluation. And that is https:// bit.ly, so that's bit.ly extension calling evaluation. And extension calling and evaluation all need to be capitalized, but those are the only caps you need to worry about. Or you can just call us at the office. You can reach me at 304-234-3673. That's 304-234-3673.
And you can also contact me at 740-695-1455. That's 740-695-1455. Hello, Karen.
Hey, Dan.
All right. So back in the weeds.
Back in the weeds. So let's talk about maybe getting out of the weeds.
Yeah, we're gonna keep moving on from last week. Yeah. Last week we went through a lot of weed biology, a lot of weed classifications, and we just kind of got lost in that weed seed bank and we never found our way out of it.
Right. So let's find our way out of the weeds by talking about control methods this week. So we got 4 control methods we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about chemical, mechanical, thermal, which is one that is kind of new there.
It's hot stuff right there.
It's hot stuff. You got to forgive us.
And then we have mulches while Karen stops laughing. All right. So these different control methods, right? They all come and play a part in the integrated weed management system that we talked about. If you just picked one of those, chances are you're not going to get very far. So there's a cost and benefit to all the different weed control methods. And the most effective weed control strategy is to take a little bit from column A, a little bit from column B, a little bit from C or D. You can't always take every angle, but the more angles you take, the better off you are with weed control. Diversify and integrate pest management strategies. All right. So I'm going to start with chemical control. And I touched on this last week. If you just look at chemicals, the way they work in general, you're going to have things that kill grasses. You're going to have things that kill broadleafs exclusively. You're going to have things that kill everything. Some things are going to be systemic. They're going to kill the entire plant. Some things are going to be contact and they're just going to kill what they touch. We call those sometimes burn down type herbicides. And that term can be used in many contexts too. So it's effective. It can be selective, like I was saying. You know, they're putting in there that it's cheap and available, but it's not always cheap. And sometimes it's very expensive.
Yes.
Some of the downsides to chemical control is you got ecotoxicity. So the environment impacts. You got herbicide resistance. We touched on that with Palmer amaranth last time. And there's human health risks. And it's not always the chemical itself. It's not always the active ingredient. Sometimes it's the preservative or the carrier that it's in for it to work right. So I know there's some drawbacks from chemical control.
Right. And so there's drawbacks to everything, right? So even when we look at mechanical control, which we're not going to worry about residue from leftover chemicals, and there's a lot of different equipment options available. So, those are some good things with mechanical control. But the negative side of things, we're looking at, it's not selective, right? You drag a hoe down a row and it's taking everything with it. And sometimes when you have volunteers helping, they take the strawberries too.
Yeah, it's steering wheel selective.
Right. And so it's not always select. It's sometimes takes out the good stuff along with the bad. And you have a lot of soil disturbance. And we've talked many, many times about the dangers of frequent soil disturbance and how it can impact your soil structure, impact your drainage, and loss of nutrients. And so, and plus you have compaction potential, especially if it's wet. So there are some negatives associated with mechanical control as well.
All right. And then as things heat up, we talk about thermal control. Karen,
I'm sorry. I'm in a mood.
All right. You are. Okay. Anyway, it is getting warm in here in the middle. It is an abnormally warm winter. So thermal control, no residue concerns, no soil disturbance, right? Sounds great. Non-selective, and it's fuel intensive. So thermal control, you're basically taking a flamethrower and burning everything down. Now, when you do that, you're killing the tops. For an annual, that might be enough to get rid of it. Maybe not. For a perennial, more than likely, it's not going to really hurt the entire plant. You're not going to get rid of it that way. But it is non-selective, so whatever catches fire, catches fire. And one of the advantages is that, like mechanical, you don't have residue concerns. Unlike mechanical control, you don't have to worry about soil disturbance. So that's it. And it is non-selective, and it's very fuel intensive. I mean, you're going through a lot of propane. It's an expensive thing, and it's very specialized. You can either carry a tank on your back, or you could retrofit your tractor.
But again, you get back into the mechanical problem of compaction, carrying a large weight around. And, for me personally, trying to put one of those gas containers on my back, I'm not really down with that. They're heavy. I mean, I can do it, but it's not my preference.
I think even people that can do it, I don't think it's anyone's preference.
That's true. I mean, I guess if you're going to carry 5 gallons of liquid on your back for herbicide, you're still in the same weight category.
That's true.
But, when you think about thermal control, one of the things that we've often talked about is composting. And if you don't get your composting hot enough, it's not going to kill the weed seeds that are in it. And so thermal control can also be used to control seeds. But again, you have to get it to the right temperature. And so there is some technique to get it right. You have to have the correct temperature, the correct exposure time, and such like that to kill some of these. So that is important to recognize as well. But, going from compost, we'll just slide right into mulches, because you can use compost as a mulch, especially if it's a wood-based compost, that's not maybe done cooking. But anyway, you can have a living mulch like wood or an organic product that's going to boost your soil fertility, and it's going to reduce your erosion. Now, your living mulches can also be more along the lines of grasses or clovers or things like that.
Right. I mean, it could be a cover crop, or it could be wood mulch, because it's still going to decompose.
But, when you think about a green mulch, something that is going to grow alongside your plants. And so, for instance, when they interplant white clover with corn, the clover is going to provide those nitrogen needs to the corn and can, reduce the amount of fertilization needed while also keeping weeds down. But those living mulches can compete with your crop. If it grows faster than your crop, you don't plant it at the right time, or it could crowd it out.
Right. Like rye. Rye is one that if you let it go to seed, you're increasing the seed bank, and then you might have rye issues that
And then you might have a weed issue for all over again, a different kind of weed issue. But there's also that cost with seeding it, right?
Yeah.
And wood as a living mulch does boost your soil fertility.
Yeah.
Whereas you have a synthetic mulch that you're looking at like your plastic mulches.
And it does add organic matter, as it decomposes, but you have to be very careful with incorporating wood mulch. And I know when easements were kind of running rampant throughout the county, people were taking the wood chips and just incorporating them into the easement. And the problem is it's not necessarily alive, but it is organic and there are microbes that will feed on it. And when you do something like that, a lot of those soil microbes will start binding nutrients, using nutrients that compete with the plant. And nothing is growing because there's no nutrients available. So it still, in a way, will compete with crop. Another example of that is that annual rye that we're talking about. If you have something like that, it puts out, if you killed it and you have all that organic matter, those roots in the ground, a lot of times as you're trying to establish your next crop, the decomposition of that previous plant is competing for nutrients. So you might have to give it extra nutrients to get over that hump.
Right. And I always try to tell people that decay is a nutrient hungry operation. And so depending on how much decay needs to occur to break down that plant matter, you're going to have to add some nutrients to go along with it, or at least expect those nutrients to not be available. So for rye, it's going to break down a lot faster than wood chunks, right? So wood mulch left over from our agricultural operation, if it's green, you're looking at 3 years before it stops being a nitrogen sink, which means it'll start giving something back. So for that first 3 years, though, it's going to be pulling nitrogen away from your plants simply to help its own decay cycle. So I tell people when they're switching to a wood mulch away from a synthetic mulch or something else that they should expect to give it a little bit of extra nutrients for the first 3 years. And after that, if you've been adding mulch every year, then the cycle sort of balances out a little bit. But the first 3 years of application, you're actually stealing nutrients away from the garden underneath.
Right.
And I do not recommend incorporating wood mulch or sawdust for that matter.
Yeah. Sawdust. I mean, same thing. Yeah, more surface area. I guess it would decompose faster, but that's the kind of stuff that even composting wood, sawdust, it requires a lot of green material on top of that.
Mm-hmm. It does.
All right. So synthetic mulches. Let's keep on going. We're getting back in the weeds again. There's a concept called stale seed bed that we can get into. Synthetic mulch also conserves soil. You basically put a synthetic mat over the areas that you want to grow. Especially vegetable producers will puncture holes and they grow their crop in that hole so that all the weeds won't really grow up against the plant. I mean, they might grow right up against the plant, but the advantage is that the plant itself will canopy out immediately around it and you won't have weeds coming in from the sides to inhibit the growth of that crop. But it's labor intensive and it can generate a lot of waste because it is something synthetic. It doesn't break down. So now you're dealing with a lot of times plastic that you need to throw away.
Yeah. And, when you're talking about labor intensive, though, it is and it isn't. So if you're looking at a machine that you have that is going to make a bed and layer mulch, it can actually save some labor. And so if you think about the type of machinery that you're going to need, you do have to have that investment. And so it can be fairly expensive as well. But in some aspects, it can actually save you labor. So there are some that they'll lay your drip tape, they'll lay your plastic, and they'll form your bed. And so from that perspective, it can be great. But again, you've got all this waste at the end of the season that you need to dispose of. Now, some plastics are biodegradable and they'll decay in the sunlight. Sometimes that causes more of a mess than if you were just to pull it up. But do reach out to your local solid waste authority and see if there's a way you could recycle your farm waste plastics. So that way we're not adding that waste into the landfill.
There you go. There's a lot of give and take, when we talk about the different ways that we can manage weeds and that integrated weed management system. So just to kind of put it all together, think about mechanical, cultural, chemical, and biological. So you got different approaches of dealing with weed management. And the ideal solution is a little from mechanical, cultural, chemical, and biological. Some examples of mechanical are going to be tillage, mowing, cultivation, electrical weeding, steam weeding, flame weeding. Those are all mechanical things. Mowing was one, taking the seed heads off before they produce seeds. That's kind of a mechanical approach to reduce that seed bed.
And again, it's time sensitive, just like applying an herbicide. You have to do it at the right time and you have to do it at the right frequency for it to be effective. And for that, you need to know what weeds you're dealing with. So once you know what plant you're dealing with, then you can think about, incorporating chemicals before you plant. So you incorporate that herbicide before you plant to get rid of that seed bank, or if you're going to start from seed, to just kill off what's already there. You could use pre-emergent herbicides, post-emergent herbicides, and you have to make sure you're combining your modes of action or mixing them up so that you're not leading to the issue we talked about before with palmer amaranth. You don't want to build resistance in those weeds. So you do have to mix up your modes of action, which is a whole program in and of itself. So we're not going to get into those weeds.
Yeah, and it's kind of it's an integrated approach within an integrated approach. So it's another way to integrate various things inside chemical control. So rotating your modes of action, and we do have those mode of action charts. And also sometimes it's as simple as utilizing products that have various modes of action in them already, so that you're not attacking the plant from only one mode of action every time, but two. So that hopefully if one will lead to resistance, the other one will kill it off, and vice versa for the other mode of action. Okay, so some examples of cultural integrated weed management practices: planting clean seeds. So making sure you're getting seeds from certified dealers, places that have been inspected by the Department of Agriculture and that are approved. If you're buying hay, the real weedy hay because it's cheap, you're not really helping your weed management problem. Row and inter-row spacing. So growing things so that it maximizes the crop, but is still canopy and prevent that. Remember, we talked about that light penetration, right? So allowing for a canopy to keep the seeds in the seed bed dormant is another cultural practice. Competitive crop varieties, so growing things that are hardy. Planting things at a time when you can get ahead of the weeds is another cultural practice. Crop rotation, intercropping, so dealing with things that are less aggressive and that you can handle. The stale seed bed method, and then the mulches. And the stale seed bed method is kind of an interesting concept too. That's where you do a little disturbance and you kill all the first flush of weeds when they're really, really small, right before you plant. And the idea there is to get rid of very competitive, aggressive weeds that follow your planting.
Right. So you're going to try to encourage those weeds to sprout and grow by giving them nice, fresh soil and sunlight. And then when they sprout, you get back out there and you destroy the babies.
Yeah. And like we were saying, you're basically allowing that open ground to give it its first wave of attack, and then you just kill it. And hopefully the second wave is not as aggressive as the first wave. It's like warfare.
It totally is. It totally is. All right, so let's move on to biological controls. And this can be a lot of different things because there's a lot of variety in the world, right? So you can graze weeds, You can use cover crops, weed seed predation, so encouraging things to eat those seeds. Natural enemies, of course, always great. Birds, things like that. Allelopathy. So there are natural chemicals that exist out there that can help reduce germination of those seeds. A very common one that most people are familiar with is black walnuts, and the chemical they release, juglone, will actually reduce the success of plants growing around them so that their seeds and their babies can have a better chance of survival. And then there's bioherbicides. Chrysanthemums have a chemical in them that's very effective for mostly insect control, but that's just an example of a biological.
Yeah. So, one example that we did talk about last week, and it was kind of before we got into too deep into this integrated weed management system. Good grazing practices where you're not overgrazing and exposing a lot of soil surface, keeping grass residuals to prevent that light from penetrating into the soil, utilizing some broadleaf herbicides for common broadleaf weeds that you've identified as issues. And that goes back to identifying the weed, trying to make sure that it's not an annual versus a perennial, and that annual is right at the end of its life cycle. Mowing off seed heads, maybe even like interseeding some legumes or something in there just to kind of increase the quality, increase competition of good varieties. You've actually done mechanical, cultural, biological, and chemical control in a pasture field. So it's not as difficult as you might think it is just to do a little bit from every category. And I know that things are going to be very specific, and you're going to have specific things that you can do with certain types of crop management systems. But that's a way in a pasture field that you can utilize mechanical, chemical, cultural, and biological practices to help deal with weeds.
Right. And, when you're looking at the biological things, that includes your funguses, your bacteria, your nematodes, and other insects and things like that. So there's a lot of opportunity out there, and there's been a lot of research done on these alternative control methods. So do reach out, do look into the different varieties that are available.
Sometimes, when we talk about whether certain practices, certain things you do are going to be high risk and low risk, we can break that down into not only practices, but even what's there. So if you are utilizing herbicides and you're doing more than 2 modes of action, that's kind of a lower risk on the chemical option. If you're just doing 1 mode of action, tip it to the high risk as far as chemical resistance goes. And it's good to know that, because you have to think not only utilizing a certain amount of chemical control into that integrated picture, but also how you do it as well. So weed control and cropping systems, if you're only doing chemicals, again, you're going to have high risk of herbicide resistance. Using the same mode of action multiple times within a growing season, you're increasing that risk. Another thing is just how you handle it as far as like how you've controlled it in the past. So if your weed infestation is high and you go in with chemicals, even if you start picking out other ways to do it, if you just straight up go in there and try to kill a field that's 90% weeds, you are risking that herbicide resistance happening because you have such a high population of weeds. So maybe going in there and trying some mechanical controls prior to chemicals. Chemicals in this instance might not be the best way to start, but it is a good way to kind of keep things in check and combine into that integrated system.
Right.
If you've never controlled weeds in the past 3 years, it might not be a good idea to start with the chemicals first.
Right.
As another example.
And when you're looking at the chemicals, we keep throwing out their different modes of action, and that can get to be a pretty overwhelming idea. But there is a really good website out there. It's iwilltakeaction.com. So iwilltakeaction.com, and it is a great resource for different methods to prevent resistance. And they talk about herbicides, fungicides, and insecticides. And you can download charts that you can just put up in your in your garage or wherever you have your mixing station to recognize, okay, well, this chemical should follow this chemical, or I've used this chemical and I have 3 chemicals. Oh, wait, they're all the same mode of action. It'll help you to rebalance which group you're using and make sure that you are doing your part to prevent resistance and keep the chemicals that we have effective so that we don't have to apply more potent chemicals.
Right. And if you talk to a lot of companies and a lot of farmers of why they like glyphosate resistant crops, it's because it allows them to use glyphosate instead of other chemicals like atrazine, for instance. That's a little bit more detrimental to the environment. It's a restricted use chemical, so you need a license for it. A lot of times when we start dealing with weed resistance, what we find ourselves doing is getting back to some of those chemicals that we steered away from due to environmental concerns and health concerns and things like that, because they've been mismanaged and developed some resistance. So I know we briefly talked a little bit about, so you treat something with a chemical and you don't change your management style, that weed's just going to come back. So if you're not managing weed resistance, you're going to end up going back to the way things were because you're not changing your management strategies. It's interesting in a bad way how we're reverting to more primitive ways to deal with weeds because we're mismanaging the technology.
Well, we also need to consider that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, right? So anything you do is going to have an impact. So even if we're just doing the stale seed bed, we're not using any chemicals, we're using the stale seed bed method. If we aren't going back and adding something else into that control, what you're going to have happen is the seeds that germinate later are going to become the dominant seed bank. And your stale seed bed technique is no longer going to be functional because the seeds are going to germinate later than you need to plant your crop. So you will still need to do something else to deal with the ones that still come up because they are going to create the seed bank of the future generations. So everything you do is going to have an impact. So you have to try to think ahead of the weeds, think ahead to find out, okay, if I do this, what could the potential long-term impact be? And how do I reduce that negative impact and focus on the positive impacts? So there are things that you can do, and integrated pest management is that method that has been developed and researched to try to get to the point where we are using multiple things together to get more of the positive impact and less of the negative impact.
Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.